once again, Robin, it's good to be here with you and to discourse with you, to pick your brain as a historian, as a Pan-Africanist. And, um, Pan-Africanism, to a large extent was, I think, defined, the perspective that I like to think of, by my dad, shall we say, in the first half of the 20th century. And one of the things he said that, a people without the knowledge of their past history, traditions, and culture is like a tree without roots. And I think that's very, very true. And I think that's shall we say, one of the problems with Pan-Africanism today, in terms of people being able to, on the one hand, define what Pan-Africanism is, and on the other hand, to orient themselves in terms of how they live their lives relative to Pan-Africanism, because Pan-Africanism really is the concept of us as a people, and not only us as a people in terms of the continent of Africa, but us as a global people with a history, with traditions, and with culture that go back to the beginning of the human species, let alone the beginning of writing and the beginning of history. But that history has not been told appropriately. We still live in some sense by European history, and that is what's taught to us. I can remember, growing up, even in the Pan-African home of Garvey, with a whole series of the Encyclopedia Britannica, where supposedly all the knowledge that was worthwhile was housed. And, my parents got me, well, it was just me and my brother, this Encyclopedia Britannica. And anytime we had questions, that's where we went. So that was our reference. I'm saying that we don't have a reference point as African people. And I'm going to use John Henry Clarke's quotation, where John says, history is the clock that people use to find their political time of day. It is also a compass that they use to locate themselves on the map of human geography. And human geography means the life that we live on a day-to-day basis. Who we are, how did we get here, where are we going, have we done anything before, or, are we still the victims of the historiography of the European that says, we have never done anything at all, ever. Civilization started with the Greeks. You guys are primitive. You're animists. You're polygamists. You're polytheists. You're like anathema. You're subhuman. I don't think we have corrected that in terms of our version, shall we say, of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Not using that as a reference point per se, but just saying that we need a repository of historical knowledge that is going to undergird not only the universities in terms of their teaching of history, but all of our education at whatever level, whether it's kindergarten, etc., etc. You're a historian. Where are we in that process? And can we speed up the process, or how do we get to where we need to be?
I'm glad you asked that question, because I think I'm uniquely placed to answer it. One of my colleagues, Emmanuel Adama, teaches that now is the best time ever to be an African historian, because the game has changed so much. It's amazing how much the game has changed. All right, basically, if we were to trace the last, say, 100 years, you had in the 1920s, the African-American historian, Drusilla Dunjee Houston, who did the book Wonderful Ethiopians of the Ancient Kushite Empire. And what she talks about are the ancient civilizations of Nubia, Egypt, Sumeria, Arabia, and the Indus Valley. And so is giving Black people an ancient history. But outside of that ancient history, she didn't say much else. Then you had W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote, first of all, a book called The Negro. I think that was about 1915 or something. And then he updated the book and it became Black Folk Now and Then. And then he updated it and it became The World and Africa. And The World in Africa is actually very comprehensive. North, South, East, West, Central Africa, Black civilizations in the Middle East, Black civilization in India. Now, the narrative is thin, but the scope of what Dr. Du Bois attempted was really, really big. In 1954, you had Ghanaian scholar John Coleman de Graaf Johnson wrote African Glory. And he's got the ancient Egyptians in there. He's got Carthage, Numidia, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Great Zimbabwe, Munu Mutapa, the Congo civilization. Really advanced the game to a massive extent. Then in the 70s, you had Professor Chancellor James Williams, The Destruction of Black Civilization, where he's not just explaining how we built civilization, why those civilizations aren't here today, and what role did the Europeans and Arabs have in destroying that civilization, and where's the proof? All right, then you had Dr. Charles Finch, African-American scholar, who wrote the science and technology book, The Star of Deep Beginnings, where he's looking at Africa from the position of science and technology, dealing with Nubia, Kemet, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, the Yorubas, etc., 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 from the position of science and technology, from the position of metals, from the position of architecture, from the position of astronomy, from the position of numbers. Monster book. And inspired by all of these books, I wrote When We Ruled. Then you've got people like the UNESCO people, United Nations. They got a team of mostly Black scholars to put together an 8-volume history of Africa. And while you could criticize X or Y or Z, it kicks butt. It kicks butt. And then more recently, you've got people like Vincent Taraku Farrar. So when it comes to what we can now teach, the game has changed. We're no longer in a position that we have to get European books and read between the lines. That position, we've moved past that. We can now resurrect African civilizations in terms of their history, in terms of their architecture, in terms of their metallurgy, in terms of their sciences, in terms of their sociological structures. We can now do this with many of the African civilizations. We can't do it with all of them, but we can do it with many of them. And the breadth of analysis that we now have, the game really has changed. Where it's at right now is there are scholars attempting to reconstruct individual African monuments, looking at the ruins of what's there, and then working out, okay, what would that have looked like fully restored? We're now at that stage, and we're now starting to be able to do it monument by monument. So when it comes to what was our history and what does it look like, even some non-Africans, that there's this whole Game Boy culture, and the Game Boy people, where they're playing video games, and they've got video games set in ancient civilizations. And I've now seen that they've got some of those ancient civilizations is set in ancient Aksum, Ethiopia, set in Hausaland. And I've seen the graphics that they're using to resurrect Aksum. It's accurate. The graphics that they're using to resurrect Hausaland, it's accurate. Now, I could argue, okay, I don't like the way they depicted X, or they depicted Y, or they depicted Z. But we could argue, but the bottom line is that kind of imagery, we can now reconstruct that kind of imagery, and people have done it. So what that means then is the reliance on ancient Egypt as the centerpiece of Black history. It's still important, but there are now so many other centers of African civilization whose heritage we can reconstruct now. The game has changed.